Well,
Very good.
everyone, I'm really happy to be here with my friend Gilbert Marcus. We've known each other online for a little while now, a couple of years, and we've worked on some projects together, and we've had some wonderful debates. And sometimes we've even managed to convince each other of something, maybe here and there. I don't know, but I'm really glad to have you on here, Gilbert. If you don't mind, just telling us like who you are, just a little bit, where you're from, what your background is, that kind
Well,
of
it's,
thing.
it's a real pleasure, and it's really great to see a live face and hear a real voice rather than just a vague shape on Facebook.
Yeah.
So I'm really an early medieval historian in real life most of the time, but I came to that uh, through theology, really. Um, I spent 21 years as a Dominican and read a lot of theology during that time, and it was actually in a Dominican priory where I found myself converted rather dramatically
Hmm.
in a toilet, actually, to early medieval Gallic history. So I found a book, a translation of a 12th century Gallic uh, text, which made me think I must get involved in this material and immerse myself in it. It was a text called Buluhuvna, the madness, or Sweeney, the madness of Sweeney, a king who committed murder and went mad, and then finally is reconciled to himself, to humanity, to God, after 7 years of madness. But I was so blown away uh, by the literature, by the poetry, by the imagery, by the theology of it all, that I kind of slithered sideways out of theology. And I had been spending a lot of time reading Aquinas, Augustine, Wittgenstein, Karl Marx, um, and went sideways into the 7th century ultimately. And I've got been stuck there ever since. But so in the last few years, I've gradually returned to some of my more strictly theological roots and explored this idea of God as nothing and the language that we use in that uh, discussion, if you like, the ways of talking about God. Yeah.
Yeah, that's wonderful. And just for everyone who's watching, that's what we're going to talk about is God is Nothing. And Marcus has a new book that he's just come out with that title, right? God is Nothing.
God as
Um,
nothing. Yeah.
God as Nothing, yeah. And we'll have a
Yeah.
link in the show notes on YouTube and on the website for anybody who wants to get a copy. So that'll all be available for everyone.
Lovely.
Yeah, and so hit me with it. What's your book? Like what do you want to
Well,
say about it? I love apophatic theology, as everyone watching will know, and I love all this stuff. So
it looks like that.
there you go. Yeah.
And that crack is part of the design. It's not damage I've done to the cover. Uh,
Is there some
it,
symbolism behind the crack, or how did you guys come on that?
um,
It's a nice cover for sure.
yeah, it's kind of eye-catching. Somewhere in the back of my mind, I had Leonard Cohen droning away.
Yeah.
There is a
Yeah.
crack in everything. That's how the light gets in. But
Yeah.
everything which is, everything is everything.
Hmm.
There's a crack in that. And what comes in is not part of the everything.
Yeah.
So it's the
Mhm.
nothing that. Now, I didn't. I'm not going to get too systematic about all that. I mean, it was just a kind of image that spoke to me in a
Mhm.
very general sense. Uh, when I was trying, I actually went round all my neighbours with. I live on an old riverside embankment, which is kind of loose gravel and sand and mud, and a lot of the houses in my area have uh, started sinking into the ground,
Dear.
and they've all got cracks in their walls. So I had to go around my neighbours with a camera photographing. Can I photograph your crack? Because I kept asking them. And
That's a picture you took.
sorry,
You took that picture.
yeah, I took a lot of. I sent my publisher about 200 different cracks. So,
That's awesome. I didn't realize that. I figured it was like you found one online or something. That's so cool.
yeah.
Yeah.
So yeah, so that's the background to the crack. The background to the book is kind of multifarious. Um, an important part of it is having studied theology with a man called Herbert McCabe. Many people will have come across that name. He actually baptized me in 1957. And he had been a friend of my parents when they were at university together. And I was delighted to find that he was a Dominican and taught me in Oxford.
Oh wow.
Um,
That's so cool.
and I was
Yeah.
very excited by his theological approach. And his theological approach is very much the one that I've taken on, um, about the fundamental insight about God as creator. If God is the creator of everything which exists, God cannot be one of the things which exists. Otherwise, he would be part of what is standing in need of explanation. Okay. And this was a real moment of illumination for me in Oxford when Herbert was teaching there. And he said it's one of the great joys of his life to have been teaching there for I don't know how many, 40, 50 years, and recognizing
Didn't
a
you?
moment. Sorry?
Didn't you lecture on it too? Didn't you teach on it as well?
Sorry?
Oh, my microphone is broken again. Jeez.
Yeah.
I asked, didn't you lecture on it as well?
Yeah, well, I eventually taught a course called God as Nothing at Edinburgh
Mm,
University
mm,
some years later. What's rather nice about Herbert, of course, is having taught me, well, he died eventually. He died in, I think, 2001 or no, 1999, 98, 99. Anyway, um, so I carried him out of the church. I carried his coffin out of the church for his funeral. So he kind of, I entered the church in his arms when he baptized me, and he left the church. Well, he's the church militant in my arms as I took him out for burial, um, which was a great source of happiness to me, really.
mm.
Um, so there was that more academic impetus to write in the book, and the excitement of discovering this way of understanding our God talk, our God language in this way, which partly it owes something to a kind of Neoplatonic metaphysics. It owes something to the very basic human question about why do things exist rather than nothing exist. I mean, that's not a Neoplatonic question in particular, but you might offer a Neoplatonic answer. But it's a very basic human to stand and look at everything and be filled with awe, a sense of mystification, mystery, of delight at everything. So there's a kind of human experiential aspect to it all. There's another really important strand for me in my kind of, partly in the development of my understanding, but also in my motivation for writing the book. And that is to do with the people I love. Um, Most people I love would describe themselves as atheists. And I've had many, many conversations, and some of them think it's a bit strange that I regard myself as a believer, as a theist, as a Christian. And we often, especially late in the evening, is uh, when you sort of mellow into a certain way of talking with your friends, you know,
Yeah.
when the whiskey's half finished. Um, there is a moment when you start talking about these things, and very often I would ask, they would say that I'm an atheist, and I would say, well, you know, what is the God you don't believe in? And always the answer they give to the question about the God they don't believe in is a God that I don't believe in either, and is a God that
It's the new
no
atheists like to call it.
sorry,
The new atheists have this term called sky daddy. That's a pejorative for
yeah,
people who think
exactly,
in God, and that's
yeah,
what my friends will always say. Oh yeah, you're
yeah,
sky daddy.
yeah, exactly. There's
Yeah,
something that is worth
yeah.
worshipping, and so I say, well, this isn't the God that I believe in,
Mhm.
and it generates more discussion, and it's those discussions with people I care about which have often provided the kind of mental pegs that I want to hang this narrative on, my story, my little. I haven't got a sustained argument really. I'm kind of circling around as I describe it in the foreword to the book. There's something, one idea in the book, and I just poke it from different directions and see what happens. There's no great sustained argument, but following biblical, scriptural, patristic, medieval, modern poetry, Wittgenstein, Derrida, trying to weave some kind of a spell almost to, to, to dislodge the imagined being from our heads, you know, this entity. Uh, and to show how, having dislodged that being and having encountered the unknowable mystery, which we call God, which is not any kind of a thing, how many of our human problems are resolved, how many of our intellectual problems, the challenges to our understanding of ourselves and of the world and of our faith, are much less problematic when we let go of that idea of the individual entity, the being, which we call God. Forget that. That's idolatry. That's to worship something is idolatry. So those discussions with my friends, those very often late night discussions, or discussions which go on for hours as you walk over a hill somewhere, getting lost in a bog, in between cursing each other for not being able to read a map, you have these conversations, and it's very enriching. And those conversations have helped me a lot. And so that encounter with friends, family, and their complete inability to imagine why anybody would want to call themselves a Christian. When that's read sympathetically, you find actually that there's a lot more interesting, rich thinking going on there. And many of them will say, no, I don't believe in any kind of a God, but I do believe in love, and I think it has a kind of an absolute value. And the Christian will simply say, well, yeah, God is love, and he who abides in love abides in God. Erecting sort of confrontational ideological positions, theism versus atheism, is always absurd. Partly because the argument between theism and atheism is an argument about what exists. Yeah. But if God is not one of the things which exists, then it's a silly argument to begin with. Mm-hmm. To say that something exists is to make an argument about what the world is like.
Mm-hmm. I wrote an essay on apophatic theology a while ago, and I called it "God Does Not Exist," which is something Eriugena actually says in his paraphrasing that I loved. And of course, he doesn't mean God. He's not an atheist. What he's saying is that you're not going to find God by walking around the bush. Well, you will find God walking around the bush looking for him, but not because he's going to be a rock or a stone or one of the things in the bush, because he's the source of the bush. And I don't know if you guys use the word bush. I've run into this with Americans, but I mean forest when I say bush. But yeah,
wilderness, whatever.
There you go.
Yeah. So those are the two. There was partly this study of theology and the academic background, and partly my experiential social network and the friends and the experience I have, because I've always been very much involved in left-wing politics in one way or another, and there's a real reluctance to discuss Christianity, certainly in Britain on the left, probably true in Canada too.
Same as Canada.
And so I've always been looking for a way of making sense to my comrades, basically, and just casting a little shadow of doubt over some of the certainties which they seem to be lumbered with. Yeah.
Well, thank you for sharing that. That's great. It's nice to have that background. Those are three good angles to come at it from. Just to recap them quickly, you had what I'm going to brutally call apologetics, and I realize it's something much better than that. But the conversation around it,
theology,
and then the academic intellectual interest, and what was the third one? I'm just trying to make sure I remember.
The political, social.
Yeah. And I think that's an important piece
that's
too.
Really,
go ahead.
Sorry, I was going to say the political, social thing. Many of those people are my friends as well as my political comrades, and so that was really an extension of the friendly, conversations. But it has a particular angle of its own. And what I would say about all that is, again, that political solidarity is simply the exercise of love in the political context. It's not another thing. So what I said about the love that my friends shared with me, and in which which I see as a form of loving God, uh, that reaches also into the political sphere.
Mm.
Um, what goes on in those smoke-filled rooms as you appoint a committee for the abolition of the death penalty or whatever it might be? It's tedious. It involves a lot of photocopying and emailing, but it's part of the divine life in us.
Mm.
You know.
Yeah. Yeah, I agree with that for sure. It's not exactly the same, but I was thinking about in the world of sort of social activism and whatever. I run in a lot of super liberal circles, both economically and politically, and also sort of socially. And so there's a lot of pushback against God as a man. And while I like to use Lord as like my go-to always,
Yeah.
and for me it's like a non-gendered thing anyway. But I'll write about God as He, and I have nothing against that. But a lot of my people in our community wanted some more feminine language for God, and I got a lot of pushback from some of my more like Orthodox Catholic friends who were, I run in various circles, and so that
Okay.
it was a hit on one side and a bomb on the other. Um,
Can't please all the people all the time.
no, but I realized that the apophatic theology is really, I start from an intellectual perspective now. I mean, I do it from a social perspective because I think women need to be given a place in society, and they need an image of God which to connect with, and all of that. But from a theological perspective, I think the apophatic argument is the best one you can make for not allowing
Yeah.
only one gender to be named of God, because then all of a sudden God is a thing, right? Gender by definition is separation. It's the distinction between things.
Yeah.
And so if God has a gender or is not one gender or something like that, then God is not God.
Yeah.
And so I think that even like, and from those angles, it can have a lot of social impact as well. I managed to convince a couple of sort of more traditional people. They said, that's the best argument I've ever heard. I'm not changing my language, but at least I don't hate you
Oh,
for it.
that's fair enough.
Yeah.
Little steps get you there
Yeah.
slowly. Um,
Yeah.
yeah, and people are quite happy to say, God is a rock,
Yeah.
God is a raging fire, God is a mother hen, God is a moth in the Bible, for sake. All these images, and they're quite happy to say, yeah, those are pictures. But when we use a pronoun, they think that's not a picture. That
Yeah.
there's a kind of everybody has a kind of threshold where the language that they are happy to use as imagery and pictures and metaphor and analogy suddenly becomes literal when you cross that line. And for some people, that line is the gendered pronoun. But so to keep leading people into the idea of God as nothing, as you say, is a way of resolving that problem to some extent, I think.
Mhm.
But I think it's interesting to think when you mentioned earlier that about women who need to feel that there's a language that speaks to them, and that feminine language about God helps to do that. My experience is that a lot of men need feminine language about God as well, especially people like me who had had quite a strict dad. And I fought with them all the time until I was about 19. And the word father for me, for many years,
Yeah.
conjured up um, wasn't anything remotely like repression, but it was authority, and it was something against which I had committed to pitch myself in many ways, where the language of motherhood wouldn't. So, I don't think it's just women that need to explore the female language about God. Um,
That's a great point. Yeah.
sorry?
I agree completely. That's an excellent point. Yeah.
Yeah. But I
Yeah.
also think that
Yeah.
the gendered language about God, if when we use male imagery about God, is essentially maleness is about sex and femaleness is about sex, um, traditionally, and the use of male language about God in conjunction with our response, our receptivity, it sexualizes it. It uses the sexual metaphor. We are to be impregnated with the word of God. That the logos spermaticos, as they used to call it,
That's right.
in the good old days. The impregnating
Mhm.
word, which we are supposed to bear within us and make it bear fruit.
Mhm.
In a sense, so male language about God also genders the whole of humanity, as receptive, impregnatable. Uh, Essentially, we're waiting for God to enter us, to penetrate us, and to impregnate us with His word. So that sexual metaphor about God and humanity can be very enriching, and both male and female language about God, as long as we remember that God is not a thing, and don't take any of that literally.
Mhm.
The language invites us into a dance. It invites us or into a drama or into a choreography and a poem. None of it's meant to be taken literally, but it's meant to make us bear a certain kind of creative fruit and to dance it, to sing it, whatever it is that we do with it.
For sure. One of the points I often make when I'm getting pushback from people about my feminine language for God is that I'm totally happy with masculine language for God. God as Father is an excellent image. It's a huge part of the tradition. It's a completely
Yeah,
appropriate, and there's nothing wrong with it at all. I'm not, and people get confused. They think if you want to call God she, that means you're like hating men or like refusing to call God he. In my
yeah,
liturgies and prayers, I'll just alternate. I'll just like switch
yeah.
back and forth.
Well, I do
Um,
that. I do that
yeah.
in the book as well.
Oh, nice. I'm glad to hear that.
It's
Yeah. Yeah.
not so much about God, but about all the people I talk about.
Sure. Yeah. Yeah.
But it's full of examples of human dilemmas of various sorts, and
Yeah.
it's always a he and a she and a she and a he. So,
Hmm.
yeah.
Yeah. So I'm curious, if you don't mind me asking, about how or if God is nothing has become part of your prayer life. I'm a big fan of the cloud of unknowing, and I like to try and practice apophatic prayer. Though one of the things that I realized was at first like it wasn't working, and of course they're like, well, everybody always says, well, stick with it. It's not going to work right away.
Yeah.
But then I read the cloud more closely, and I realized that it has this whole Neoplatonic scheme of an ascension of spiritual practices, culminating
Okay.
in apophatic prayer, and not beginning with
Yeah.
apophatic prayer. And so I actually based most of my studies from there to figure out what those previous steps were, flesh them out, and try to lead myself through them so that I could come back to apophatic prayer and have it be more fruitful. And I'm just curious if you've had any experience with that kind of thing that Eckhart might talk about, or the cloud, or.
Um, I say, there's there's a whole tradition, biblical tradition of
Mm,
of of groaning.
mm,
That
mm.
what does Paul say about the Spirit praying within us with groans
Yeah,
beyond
unutterable by words or something like that.
yeah,
Yeah.
beyond speech and so on.
Yeah.
It's for me part of the delight of the God as nothing thing is that when I pray, I'm not addressing myself to an object of any description.
Mm,
I'm allowing the God who is the ground of my being, the source of all my life, to speak in me and about himself in me
mm,
and to back to himself again, I suppose, in some way, but not in the sense that I've got to attend to a particular object, nor that I have to. I mean, groaning is fine, silence is fine. Um, but I love using the Psalms. I suppose. I mean, I spent years singing the Psalms for 2 hours a day in a monastery. So, um, not all at once, but
You didn't do the
uh,
whole Psalter every day like the Desert Fathers apparently did.
sorry.
Oh, I wish my microphone would work. I said the Desert Fathers claim to have chanted the whole Psalter every day. I said, did you manage to keep up
Yes,
with them? But
I know. I didn't even try. But one of the things that I love about
yeah.
that period of my life, and I love doing it, but is that I have psalms in my head all the time when I'm
Mm,
wandering about.
mm,
Um, the the psalms provide a vocabulary for me to
mm,
reflect on what's happening in my life, and spontaneously, uh, moments of a verse of a psalm will come to my head and uh, echo around somewhere with regard to what I'm doing at any moment in the day.
mm,
Um, and sometimes it's wonderful, full of song, praise and the heavens proclaim the glory of God, etc. And it's all wonderful. And sometimes I can't remember which psalm it is. It's a psalm we sung on Tuesdays at lunchtime, which finishes off Friend and neighbor you have taken away. My one companion is darkness. And then you sing, Glory be to the Father, and to the Son, and to the Holy Spirit. I mean, the madness of the Psalms and the way they can accompany you in whatever place you are in your life and whatever's going on in your life. They will provide the movement through where you are back to some kind of sense of the presence of God, whatever that actually means.
It doesn't mean anything. It means nothing. Nothing to do about anything. We did a line I grabbed from Bernard McGinn, who did a talk at the University of Glasgow. Are you at University of Glasgow or Edinburgh? I always get mixed up.
That's where I work now. I work in Glasgow
Yeah.
University.
Oh yeah. Were you part of that when Bernard McGinn talked about? He did a talk there that's on YouTube that I've watched like a million times.
Okay.
It's called Nothingness in the Jewish and Christian Tradition or something.
Well,
I could
I'm
send
not
you the
sure.
link, and I could even put the link in the show notes for everybody else too.
Oh, lovely. Yeah.
But I was just like, I hadn't thought about it till this morning. I put it on while I was doing my things just to kind of get my
Okay.
wheels turning about this morning's conversation, and I realized it was University of Glasgow. I thought, oh, I bet, I bet you helped put that on or something, but I guess I don't know.
No, I didn't even know about it.
There you go. There you go. Yeah. Yeah. I mean, my introduction to the apophatic prayer came mostly through Eriugena. So I had an interest in Celtic Christianity, which maybe one day we could have a chat about that. I'd love to. And I started with the popular Celtic Christianity that was available to me as a layperson at the bookstore and all that kind of stuff. And found a lot of things that I liked, but what I really wanted was the primary sources. And so as soon as someone referenced this person or that person, I go look them up. And someone referenced Eriugena, so I went and bought a copy of the Paraphysian and figured, well, I'll just see what he has to say. And I opened it, and I had no idea what was going on. But I decided just to slug my way through it, and just to learn the Neoplatonic language and just to
Yeah.
read it and see what happens. And it changed me a whole lot.
Yeah.
And it's so full of beautiful things. And then that led me to Dionysius, because Eriugena has translated the Dionysian corpus into Latin for the West, and cites him at length. He'll have half a page will be like a full quote of Dionysius. And so I've read a lot of him too, all of it in translation because I'm just a lay reader, but it's had a huge impact on me. And one of the things I love about these apophatic theologians is that even though they're talking about the nothingness and the indescribability of God, and a topic that seems like there wouldn't be much to say, they have this beautifully poetic spirit that seems to come out of whatever theologian engages this material. And I've never read any of the modern theologians, so maybe I'm just missing out, but I haven't found an apophatic theologian that hasn't had a great sense of beauty, that has that technical kind of theology that people get into sometimes, which has its place, but there's something so poetic and beautiful about it that captures me. And I think that beauty, I mean, in the Neoplatonic tradition, of course, the beauty is what calls us, what draws the love of our heart towards God, so that we long for God. But anyway, I'm just rambling now, but that's kind of how I got started with it all.
Yes, I mean, it's almost the kind of Marshall McLuhan's the medium is the message, that the beauty of your writing and your engagement with beauty in writing is not just a means to an end. It's a making present of the beauty, which is ultimately, beauty is one of the names of God. It is that which, as Thomas Aquinas says, the beauty is that which being seen pleases. And that's a very dry way of putting it, but it's what elicits delight. Um, for Thomas, beautiful things are beauty. We're attracted to things because they're beautiful, but and we love them because they're beautiful. But things are beautiful because God loves them. So that the beauty of things stands as a kind of mediating nexus or matrix or some, I don't know what the word is, a veil perhaps even, through which the beauty of God is visible to us. it's that love causes God's love causes beauty and elicits our love, and
Mhm.
so our love of beauty is a theological fact as much
Mhm.
as a sensual one. You
Mhm.
know?
Yeah, I've been playing with a nerdy idea. Maybe I'll just throw it at you, and you can tell me what you think about it. But in regards to love and beauty, we've been thinking about that Neoplatonic idea of the one and the many, which you're probably familiar with, but just for everybody
Yep.
watching, is in really basic ideas. There's the sense that you have the oneness of all things, but then there's also a whole bunch of not oneness. You know, I'm not you and you're not me, and there's different stars that aren't touching, and all that. And so, what is the relationship between the oneness of all things and the diversity of all things? And following from scripture and also just the nature of love as I understand it, it's a unifying force. I think I can't remember where Paul says it, but it's something about love is that which binds us all together in harmony. It's the unity of all things is the
Right.
love. And then I got thinking about beauty as the many, as the multiplicity, as the verdancy and the bursting forth of contrast and difference, for the sake of the good still, but the opposite of love in a way, but not opposites like they're going to cancel each other. Opposites like they're in a spectrum of one to the other. And that love is the foundation of beauty, but beauty is sort of what makes love known. And I don't know if I'm making any sense. It's an unformed thought. That's why I haven't put it anywhere
Yeah.
formal. But I'm curious if it lands at all, or if I'm just rambling. But
I suppose that in some sense, the beauty of things is not just the beauty of individual things, but the beauty of their um, being with each other and
Mhm.
their contrasts and their interwovenness. And what's that lovely poem by Hopkins? Glory to God for dappled things, for things as couple coloured. It's a great meditation on variety, and I suppose he's partly talking about what you're thinking to here, that the one is beautiful in its oneness, but what comes from the one in its variety and its contrasts um, and even in its conflicts and um,
Hmm.
disruptions, it has beauty. I mean, I think the crack in my wall is part of that.
Yeah.
Uh, it's There's the kind of beauty. One of the things I like about, I don't know, Van Gogh and other quite modern artists is the way they challenge the old classical notion of beauty as being perfect form and grace and elegance, and found beauty in a pair of old muddy workman's boots on a stone floor.
Hmm.
Um, that uh, we can find or make, in some sense, beauty or the experience of beauty out of almost anything,
Hmm.
and it's precisely the interplay, harmonic or cacophonic, if you like, between things that creates that beauty for us.
Hmm.
Um, I suppose that is what I mean about the veil. That the things that move us to desire and wonder and admiration are many, but they arise. They arouse in us the love of the beautiful, which is itself, that in all its fragmentation, is the projection onto the screen of history, the simple love of beauty, which is God. Something like that. And so all this beauty. Paul says, "Thank the Lord for all things," and that's kind of actually quite disturbing, because you're actually meant to thank God for the catastrophes of your life and the violence and the loss and darkness. But
Hmm.
if you are we able to find beauty in a workman's boots or the death of someone we love, and to thank God for it ultimately? I've always been impressed by Francis's thing about sister death, welcome sister death. You know, ultimately, it's about learning to see that all that exists is beautiful, and it's beautiful because God loves it, and it's beautiful because God loves us. Um, if you have a headache, it's because God loves you. If you get a job tomorrow, it's because God loves you. If you lose your job tomorrow, it's because God loves you.
I think that's very true, even though I get a lot of pushback sometimes for that. But and it's interesting you say that because that's how I got to the idea of the many being associated with beauty. Eriugena following, I'm pretty sure off Augustine, though you could tell me if I'm right or wrong about that, I'm sure. But he talks about how in a painting, if you only had bright colors, it would be a very ugly painting. That you need the
Yeah,
dark for the contrast, and that beauty comes about because of contrast. In a sense, he doesn't say the beauty, but he's talking about art. So I mean, what else is it but beauty?
yeah,
And uh, and that was really the image that got me thinking about, wow, the beauty includes the ugly,
yeah,
whereas the love includes all things because it's God, but like it's different. I don't know how to because I don't want to say God doesn't include God because that would be not my theology, but like there's something there I think about the beauty is present in the light and the dark, and maybe it's the love flowing through it
yeah,
that allows them both to be. And maybe there's something about loving something that makes it beautiful, because that's something that just in my own thinking, I lately I've been wondering about how you can meet someone and think they're really beautiful at a party or something, say, as a hypothetical, and then you find out and then you find out later that they're not a very nice person, and all of a sudden they look different, right? The
okay,
quality of their physical beauty has changed because of your awareness of the quality of their ethical beauty, their moral beauty.
yeah,
And and I think there's something about like the more we love something, the more beautiful it is. No matter what your baby looks like, you love it and it's beautiful. And I think it's beautiful because you love it,
yeah,
or you realize it's beautiful because you love it. The loving it is what allows you to see its
yeah.
beauty. Not that it isn't there to begin with, but yeah.
Yeah, I like that.
Mhm.
Yeah. Uh,
So another question I wanted to throw at you. I don't know if you had time to read any of those Paraphysian pages I sent you. It's sort of dense stuff. Um, but
it's the kind of thing you could read like 2 lines a day and just mull it over because it's very densely written and
yeah, it's crazy.
elusive. Yeah,
Yeah, and it's almost 1,000 pages long. It's this mass. It's like, and he says in one page what someone else says in a book. But he has this idea, and actually, this is one of the things that gets brought up in a lot of contemporary Celtic Christian reflections on Eriugena that I try to correct people on sometimes, and maybe you'd be interested to talk about it. But
yeah,
because Eriugena says that he kind of rejects. This is how it gets presented in a lot of contemporary Celtic writing. He rejects creation from nothing, the idea that God created from nothing, which he kind of does, but he's actually just playing with this word of nothing,
yeah,
and saying God didn't create out of a privation, out of an emptiness, but rather God created out of God's self, out of the fullness of being and the fullness of
yeah,
everything. And he concludes with beautifully by saying, "I don't know why we should call it nothing at all when it's really everything." The create, and
yeah.
he says creation from everything. Um, and so I thought I'd bring that up just because it's one of the contemporary folks, and a lot of my friends and people who, as we're in those worlds, like Eriugena for this creation affirming notion, and that's how people interpret it. And I don't think the original idea of creation from nothing was creation denying myself, but it's just a topic I thought might be interesting.
So, I think it's partly to do with people's understanding of the language. When people say creation out of nothing, they don't mean that there was some nothing which was hanging around, which God made everything out of.
Yeah.
There was no nothing in addition to God. There was simply God.
Mhm.
And God, although he is in one sense nothing, because he's so much in excess. God is so much in excess of anything that could be a thing. So he's not a nothing because of lack. It's a lack. It's a nothing of excess. I think that's kind of what Eugen is saying. Um, and of course, you may want to talk about God as nothing, but we also want to talk about God as everything. God shall be all in all, as we sometimes remind ourselves.
Mhm.
Um, and that is a kind of summing up of all that is in
Mhm.
in God. Uh, so I think it's perfectly legitimate to oscillate between God is everything and God is nothing, and if God made all things. The point of creation ex nihilo is that not to say that God made things out of nothing. He just didn't make things out of anything. There was nothing there except what God made.
Yeah, it was almost a reaction to an ancient idea that there was an eternal creator and an eternal matter that the creator formed in
Oh,
some
quite.
ancient
Yeah.
religions, right? That there was a co-eternal between matter and spirit, and Christians are saying no, matter came, or sorry, spirit came first, and matter emerges from spirit.
Yeah.
Um, it would be my way of framing it. I don't know if that.
Yeah. We're struggling with terms because as soon as you say the word everything or the word nothing, a whole bunch of more or less incompatible ideas emerges in people's heads, and um, it's it's impossible to settle down with a single uh, account of what these things mean. Um, that's why I think we must have both apophatic and cataphatic theology together. We have we could just fall silent and stop talking about it at all, um, and that's the kind of extreme version of apophaticism. But we can't do that, and we have to keep talking. And then the extreme version of cataphatic theology is we're seduced by the positive things we say into believing absurd things about God, that he really is a rock or whatever. And it's the dance between the two that is where we have to live in this, within our present condition as mere creatures.
Yeah, I often think of God's infinity when I think about what does it mean to be infinite. I think it means, at least for what I'm saying right now, um, to not have any boundaries placed upon you, to not have any limitations placed. There is nothing circumscribing something that is infinite. It has no limits. And if we believe God is infinite and we're talking in cataphatic language, then I think that means there isn't anything which God is not, if I can use a double negative, right? Because that would be a boundary. As soon as you said God is not a rock, then you would say you're actually wrong, right? Because God, if you said God is not a rock, then you would have to say there's a boundary of God is not allowed to be rock. And so, in that sense, God is everything. Um, and even more than everything, as Eriugena says, the source of all that is and is not. Like anything that doesn't exist is also has its its existence, so to speak, in God. Um, and so I love the idea that for Eriugena, nothing and everything end up being the same thing. They're two flip sides of the same coin. And in his great scheme of the four divisions of nature, which is what Paraphysian's based on, the first division of nature is God is everything, and the last division of nature is God is nothing,
Yeah,
and it goes from God is everything to God is nothing, and I think that's
yeah.
really cool. The God's at both ends, the Alpha and the Omega. God is the fullness of all the
And
things.
there's definitely a point in between.
Yeah, 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 yeah.
Everything is
Yeah.
constant. Yeah.
Mm.
There's one of the things that attracts me to the idea of God as nothing is kind of related to what we've just been talking about, is the idea of intimacy. Um, two individual beings can be very intimate with each other, but they will always remain two distinct entities, no matter how well they know each other and no matter how intimate they might be in their relationship. Um, they remain two. And one of my favorite little passages of Augustine, when he's in the Confessions talking to God, um, he, he says that you were more interior to me than I was to myself, closer to me than I was to myself. Um, there's a rather nice Muslim equivalent to that. God is closer to you than your own jugular vein. It's a much more physical sense of the same kind of instinct.
Yeah.
It's only possible to be completely one with God because he is not another being. Um, the unity we have with other individuals is wonderful and enriching and beautiful and tragic and fantastic. But there's always a you and a me involved. And for Augustine, the idea that human beings become God, and that God is already closer to us than we are to ourselves, and that is the beginning of our movement into God to become God. That's only possible because God is not another individual. God is the ground of our love and the ground of our life. Um, so, yeah, there are all kinds of, I don't know what you call them, spiritual, ethical, um, pastoral aspects to the idea of God as nothing. Um, issues, for example, around, I don't know, you could call it crime and punishment or obedience and reward. That there's a picture that so many Christians have in their heads that God has made certain demands of us, and if we fulfill those demands, we'll get a reward, and if we don't, we'll get a punishment. Well, that implies that God is responding to our behavior. God can't respond to anything. God is the source of everything. He doesn't respond. For God to change his mind about something, he would have to be in time. So God can't move from being angry because we've sinned to being loving again because we've repented. He can't change. Only things in time can change. And people worry, in my experience, about if they can be forgiven. And that, they have terrible sorrow for what they've done in the past. And a terrible anxiety and even fear about what might happen to them as a result, even though they're hugely sorry about it all. And part of the pastoral response to that, I think, is to say, you can't make God forgive you. God won't forgive you because you ask him. You're only capable of being sorry, and you're only capable of asking for forgiveness because God has already forgiven you. It's the love of God poured into your heart, which is making you cry, which is making you sorry, which is breaking your heart, which is making you seek forgiveness. Just as, you know, unlike us who love things because they're beautiful, God loves things and makes them beautiful. Similarly, unlike us who forgive somebody because they've repented, people are capable of repenting because God has already forgiven them. And it's this constant reminder, I think, that we need. If God is not one of the agents, the individuals bumping into each other in existence, but is the source of all, the ground of all, the wellspring of love that, as Dante says at the end of the Divine Comedy, the love that moves the sun and other stars. Everything is driven by the love of God. And the love of God is not one of the things around us. It is God. The love of God is God, and it's the source of everything. It's the source of bizarrely, in some sense, it's the source of our sin. Insofar as our sin is real, God, it's a creature, and God has made it. It's also the source of our sorrow, and it's the source of our healing. It's the source of everything. And I find that pastorally very reassuring, talking to people about their grief and their sense of lostness, I suppose, failure. Luther has something about Mary Magdalene, I think. I mean, in the good old days when people used to think that Mary Magdalene was the harlot, before modern scholarship, unfortunately, made the distinction between the woman taken in adultery and Mary Magdalene. I mean, but he for Luther, he says something like, she loved Jesus with a hearty, healthy, rotting love. I mean, it was her lustfulness which led her to Christ. And it was Christ who used that love to lead her beyond that into something else.
Mm.
Um, but all, the whole of it is the result of God's grace, God's love, from beginning to end.
Yeah, for sure. I live I'm pretty sure it's Philippians 2, for the Christ hymn. And Paul says to work out your own salvation with fear and trembling. And then the important part for this, he says, for it, I'm going off memory, so for everyone, forgive me if I get slightly wrong, but for it is God's Spirit in you that is working in you, allowing you to will,
Yeah,
to work for His good pleasure. And so
yeah,
there's this, I think, a false dichotomy in a lot of Christian dialogues between God's will and mine, as if they were separate. But like you said before, that's only possible between two things, not between a thing and the nothing. And God's will is my will. My will is a particular manifestation of God's unbounded, infinite, unknowable will. Um, and it's what allows me to do good works, and that pleases God. And I think that's just a really beautiful way to think about it. And um,
you
yeah.
know that other Hopkins poem, Christ plays in 10,000 places, lovely in eyes and lovely in limbs not his, to the Father through the features of men's faces. It's that indwelling of Christ. I live. No, it is not I who live. It's Christ who lives in me. Paul says, um, it's that indwelling of Christ, love of God, the knowledge of God in us that draws us to the divine, not our will as opposed to another will.
And I've heard it said in a million places, and I wanted to cite someone, but I can't. But there's this idea that every desire we have is really a desire for God, and that sometimes we're confused about how we're going to find God, and we don't even know we're looking for God necessarily. So not a conscious desire for God, but every time we desire something, what we're ultimately desiring is God, and we're
That's
trying to
what,
find it through things and in things
yeah,
and all the ways we know how. But
kind of what Thomas says. That everything we do is motivated by desire for the good,
mm-hmm.
for a good, even though the thing we do actually might be quite wicked.
Yeah.
Um, but what's drawn us to it is not the wickedness that's in it, but the goodness that is packaged up
Mm-hmm.
with lots of other shit, basically. Um, and it's the good. It's all that we desire is good, and of course, all that is good is of God. So for Thomas, the problem is not that we desire too much and are therefore led astray. The problem is that we don't desire enough good. We are content with lesser goods, um, with a little bit of extra money, with a bigger car, with a bit of sexual pleasure, with a triumph over a rival. These are quite nice little good things, but uh, it's because of our failure to desire larger goods that we fall short by um, desiring only these limited goods, which lead us astray.
Mm-hmm.
But even those things are motivated by desire for the good, Thomas says.
Mm-hmm. And I guess at least in Dionysius, the idea then is to set aside those desires for anything other than God. At least in the time of prayer. I don't know that I would advocate for that as it all the time thing. But when we're in the moment of prayer, I think it's a beautiful practice to let go of all desires other than the desire for God, and to cultivate and
Maybe,
to nurture that desire.
or maybe even to let go of the desire for God.
Well, and that's actually where I was going to go next. Wonderfully, Dionysius then
But
says,
Eckhart
then we
says,
need to negate our negations. He says,
yeah,
and we
yeah.
cannot cling to this idea of God as nothing, because if we cling to it dogmatically, then we've missed the entire point of it. Um, yeah, yeah.
It's the stripping thing that
Mhm,
Eckhart talks about. We've got
mhm,
some very bizarre imagery of stripping ourselves to encounter to when we encounter God naked in the bathroom, we both, he has, I don't know what kind of common bathrooms they had in medieval Germany, but everybody goes in and takes their clothes off. And it's basically prayer is, and Christian life in general, is a stripping of yourself to reveal more and more of the nothing, which is, for Eckhart, because God is nothing. We who are made in the image of God have to find the nothing which is at the core of ourselves, which is where we find that we are becoming God. So for him, the process of becoming God is stripping away everything, including desire for God. And it's a difficult sort of psychological dynamic to, why are you stripping yourself if you don't desire God? But you ultimately have to strip yourself of the desire for God. You must strip yourself of everything. And he finishes off, stand firm and do not waver in the face of your own emptiness. That's what he's looking for, the emptiness, because it's precisely at that moment of emptiness where we discover the image of God in us.
Yeah, firm emptiness. I love that. Not a wishy-washy emptiness. Not a I don't have any opinions emptiness, but a strong, firm emptiness. Yeah, yeah,
Absolutely, yeah.
yeah, yeah. It's kind of annoying. The author has several works, and one of them is called An Epistle on Prayer, very, very creatively, because modern scholars are great at that. Um, and it's this beautiful metaphor of a tree. And so the author is writing to a directee of some kind, presumably a fellow novice in the monastery or something, and describing the life of prayer as a tree, and beginning with the verbal prayers and all that kind of stuff. And he says the roots of the tree are fear, the trunk of the tree is love, or sorry, hope. The trunk of the tree is hope. And we begin in the roots with fear, and that's not like you should be afraid of God. That's like most people start praying because they're scared. Like they say, like, no, there are no atheists in a battlefield. My first heartfelt prayers were definitely, oh my God, please help me. And so we begin with fear because that's how most of us start. And then we can like grow from there into hope, into the trunk of the tree, and then that branches out to fruit. And the beautiful little piece he says, I mean, there's a whole bunch more to it, but the little piece I wanted to bring into this was that the fruit of the tree is contemplation, is the prayer of God, like to know God, but it's not ready until it's been detached from the tree, and then God can place it in his mouth and taste its sweetness, and we become united with God in our prayer. And I was like, wow, that is just one of the most beautiful images
Great
to
picture.
explain this.
Yeah.
It has to, the fears and the hopes and all that prayer life is important, but the ultimate one is the one that gets separated from all of that and taken into God. Anyway, I get excited about that metaphor, but
I like that a lot.
yeah,
And I like that fear is part of the process. And it's
yeah,
part of the process because of we are where we are. We just look out the window and see how dark,
mm-hmm.
in many ways, our lives are and the life of the world is. You know, but your image of the tree reminds me a little bit of Augustine's image of the needle of fear. He says, there is no room for fear in love, he says, quoting John's gospel. And we're not, we're not meant to be servants, we're meant to be friends. The servants are afraid of their masters, friends are not afraid of their friends. But he talks about the image of a needle. He says we need, because we are hard, we need to be punctured by the needle of fear. But attached to that needle and pulled through by it is the thread of love, charity. And ultimately, you can discard the needle. When you're sewing something, at the end of the day, everything is held together by the thread, not the needle. The needle of fear is what starts us off, but the thread of love is what ultimately holds us together and ultimately binds us to, makes us God, makes us divine. This is, in some ways, rather like your image of the tree. What's missing, I think, from the tree image, it's only about you and God, and there's something in Carmelite spirituality, that sort of progress through so Teresa's Teresa of Avila writes about uh, sort of spiritual progress, as it were. In some ways, it's a bit like the fear through hope, through to spiritual.
Or mansions or whatever it is that right?
Sorry?
The mansions or something like that. I think it's
That's
like
right,
a
yeah.
yeah, yeah.
But in the end, there's something very simple about the final fruit, which the central mansion is basically you go to church, you receive the Eucharist, you confess your sins and are forgiven. You love the sisters. When if they can't feed themselves, feed them. If they can't clean themselves, wipe their arses. It's the daily process of charity. It's almost like you think that there's this great spiritual achievement at the end of your journey, and it's not an achievement. What it actually is at the end is a very simple form of loving life. Uh, yes, you become the choice fruit that God will pluck and suck or chew or whatever, and taste your sweetness. But it's also tied up with very, very simple human loves. Uh, and I think it's partly written against the background, almost a kind of Gnostic thing, that you have to achieve something and push yourself forward and get to a more and more difficult position, and you face the challenges and drive your way through, and eventually you will have achieved this remote goal that you've set yourself. And it's almost, I think Teresa's saying almost the opposite of that. It's that you're going to have to go through all this crap in your life, but in the end, it's not a great achievement. It's an acceptance of a gift. It's not something you have to strain every muscle for. You may have to strain muscles occasionally in the meantime, but to think about spirituality as achievement rather than simply acceptance and humble gladness and joy in the presence. In some ways, it's a bit like Eckhart. Ditching, don't try to assert yourself to get to where you want to be. Just ditch stuff and let God take you where He wants you to be.
The author of the cloud has this really cool sort of dichotomy. A lot of these kind of mystics, if we want to use that language, which is really apophatic as mysticism in the formal sense. Um, these kind of contradictions that at first that seem, but I like to think of them as like, in a reciprocal relationship instead of an oppositional one. And so at one point he recommends to the student that they gather together the loving desire that he's referencing the erotic desire for God. He just calls it loving desire, whatever in my translation. And pierce the cloud of unknowing with it, which is our ignorance that we can never pass with our mind, which separates us from God in the sense of we can't know God with our mind. And that love will transcend all of your thoughts and make it into God. And then he says, and if you're struggling with that, then just beat on that cloud of unknowing over and over and over again with your love. Beat on it over and over and over again. And it's like that's so like determined. But then at another place he says, if this practice, in reference to a different practice, because he gives a whole bunch of practices, but he says, if this practice is not working for you, then one of the ones that works the best for me is to lay down like a coward and quit. I think what a beautiful thing to have both those teachings in the same book, right? Like, don't be lazy, get out there, like really try, and then when it doesn't work, give up. And it's just like it's such a beautiful way to lead.
Which of those will bear the fruit,
Yeah, I think both do. I think there's value in the beating on the cloud before we give up. If we just start with the giving up, then what have we gained?
Yeah,
but if we beat against the cloud until finally we're so exhausted that we give up, then that's a different giving up. That
I think the same is true about theology. The
Yeah.
moment of revelation in systematic philosophical theology, the most illuminating moments are when your language breaks down. A bit like your cloud of unknowing picture, that you're knocking your head, you're desperately struggling with nouns and verbs and adjectives and prepositions, and you're struggling with allegory and analogy and assertion and denial and trying to make your language make sense. And there's a, there's a moment at which you recognize that your language is a building which is going to fall around your ears. You've constructed something. Nothing you've constructed is ever going to be adequate for expressing the mystery which you're talking about. And it's at the moment of collapse that some glimmer of light actually breaks in. It's the crack in the wall. It's just beginning to happen. Yeah. So there's a nice story about Aquinas. Just shortly before he died, he had a kind of terrible vision, or a terrible vision or a beautiful vision, I don't know. And he said, "Everything I have written is straw compared to what I have just seen." You know, it's the collapse of the. We only get to that point by trying to say something sensible, but it's only when all the sensible things we've said have collapsed that we are finally confronted with an insight into the mystery.
Yeah, yeah, for sure. And I think like with Aquinas, who I haven't read at all, but I know I've heard that quote of the everything I wrote is straw at the end of the Summa or whatever, and a lot of people
Yeah.
will kind of use that to be like, see, even Aquinas didn't believe this stuff or whatever, but it's like that's not, I assume, what he's getting
Not the
at,
point.
and in the cloud of unknowing, the idea of unknowing is not ignorance, right? So like
Yeah.
ignorance and unknowing are not the same thing. Unknowing is a kind of knowledge. In the Greek, we would call it gnosis, which makes people think of the Gnostics, but it doesn't have to, of course, and I'm sure you know about all that. But this idea of a knowledge which is of the heart, a knowledge which transcends reasoning and language, but is still a real encounter with something. It's not an ignorance. Much like we were saying before, the nothingness of God is not a lack or a privation. Um, and I can't remember what I was even talking about. My brain just farted right there. So, oh yeah, the pre and post rational is what I'm trying to get at. And so I think there's a pre rational idea of ignorance that sometimes contemplative folks in the modern world want to say, I don't need theology, I don't need philosophy, right? Because I have the unknowing. Right? Like I just encounter God in the thoughtlessness, and I don't need any of that. It's all straw.
Yeah.
Um, but unknowing comes after all of the education and the spiritual formation and the catechism and all that stuff, very, very clearly in the cloud, very, very essentially in the cloud. And I think
Yeah.
we go from pre-rational to rational, and then there's this post-rational, which is this sort of unknowing, this ability to see clearly beyond language, which is what faith is, I think, to see with the heart, to know beyond words, as it says in which Ephesians or something. Um, anyway, yeah. So I think it's
Yeah.
really important to say that to not degrade intellectual activity just because we
Absolutely.
have an apophatic theology, which is a
A
trap I
building,
think a lot of people fall into.
a building won't collapse until you've built it.
Yeah, 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 yeah. And
And
you need the rubble.
it's, only, it's in the rubble that you find the
Yeah.
light. Yeah. Or at least through the crack. No, because I mean, without that, all you have is some kind of sentimental, mushy sort of
Mm.
experiential. Nothing wrong with experiential, but
Yeah.
we are rational beings. We've made that way, and
Mm.
it's essential to our humanity to be
Mm.
language using rational animals.
Yeah.
There's a
Yeah, for
nice
sure.
line. I don't know if Man for All Seasons, the play about Thomas More.
Mm.
Uh, the author's name escapes me at the moment. Um, but Thomas says to somebody in a dialogue in this play, God made the plants to show his simplicity and the animals to show his beauty. But man he made to serve him wittily in the tangle of his mind.
I like that.
It's a great expression. Um,
Yeah.
we are tempted to become prematurely simple, I think, to give up on the intellectual struggle. And it's not a good look.
Mhm. And definitely all of the apophatic theologians wrote really dense philosophy.
Oh,
John of the Cross included, Teresa of Avila included,
yeah.
But I realize now, I just looked at the clock, I lost track of time because I love these things so much. But we've been chatting for a while, and I don't want to take away from your day or your family life or whatever it is that you have going on. But um,
Yeah.
yeah, is there anything else you want to add, or that you felt like I don't have to hang up right away or anything? But it's
I don't think there's anything I particularly felt I wanted to say that I haven't said, but I've really enjoyed talking to you. It's been lovely. I do hope you're going to come to Scotland and sit by my fire and talk to me over a whiskey
I
at
would
some
love
point.
that. Yeah, yeah. Yeah. I mean, here we call it Scotch because Canadian whiskey sucks, and we all drink Scottish whiskey. So if
Quite right. Yeah.
we get
As
over
long
there
as
and
it's not American.
what's that?
As long as it's not American.
Oh, yeah. Well, that's probably even worse.
Well,
I don't know. Yeah,
I
but
wasn't. I wasn't so much thinking about the quality of the whiskey as about
the quality of
the
the conversation and
political
the quality of
relations.
the fire. I like a good fire. Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah, no, I would love that. If I'm over there, I will let you know. And if you're ever in Northern Ontario for some random reason, shoot me a
Yeah,
message for sure.
I'll look you up. I
Yeah,
will. Yeah,
yeah, and
it's very nice. No, I'll no doubt bump into you several times a day, as I generally do on Facebook.
it
But it's been very nice actually having a proper conversation.
really has. Yeah, no, I very much enjoyed this. This was great, and
Yeah,
I hope we do it again at some point. No rush or anything.
I hope so.
For now, I'll say bye, and I'll wrap things up. So thank you all if you made it this far through our conversation. I hope you guys got something out of it, and all the best.
Thank you very much, Justin. Look after yourself.